Hey guys, tonight we are doing something a little different. We are dropping you, yes you, directly into the dust and dry heat of an ancient Egyptian desert military camp, somewhere on the sun-scorched edge of the known world, roughly 3,000 years ago. Picture it, the sky is already bleaching from deep violet to a hard, merciless orange. The sand is cold under your bare feet. Shockingly cold, actually, because the desert doesn't do anything halfway, and somewhere ahead of you, a few hundred leather-tough soldiers are stirring, coughing, spitting, and preparing for another day that will test every single system your body has ever developed. There is no coffee. There is no shade worth mentioning. There is no HR department. And there is absolutely, definitively, no way you are lasting 24 hours out here without a little help from yours truly. You probably won't survive this if we are being honest. But that is exactly why it is so fascinating to try. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from tonight and what time it is there. I love seeing those roll in from every time zone imaginable. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice, before the smell, before the noise, before any of the genuinely alarming sights that are about to become your daily reality, is the scale of the silence that is being broken. It is the kind of silence that only exists at the edge of a desert, the kind that feels ancient and permanent, like it was there before people and fully intends to outlast them. And then, all at once, it shatters. A trumpet call or something close to it, a long nasal blast from an instrument that sounds like it was designed by someone who once heard a trumpet described but never actually saw one, cuts through the pre-dawn air, and the camp lurches into motion. You are at a New Kingdom Egyptian military encampment, and the most useful thing you can know right now before anything else is where exactly here is. Because location, in the ancient Egyptian military imagination, was everything. Egypt's army operated across an enormous range of environments, from the swampy delta lands in the north to the scorched sandstone corridors of the Sinai Peninsula to the river-threaded savannas of Nubia in the south. Depending on which pharaoh is currently sitting on the throne and which neighboring power is currently testing his patience, you could find yourself camped anywhere along that vast, punishing arc. For tonight, let's place you somewhere in the Sinai, that triangular wedge of desert that connects Africa to Asia and has been causing geopolitical headaches for essentially all of recorded history. It is the overland bridge between Egypt and everything Egypt sometimes wants to conquer and sometimes desperately needs to defend against. The year, roughly speaking, is somewhere in the neighborhood of 1275 BCE, which puts you smack in the reign of Ramesses II, a pharaoh so aggressively famous that he essentially invented the concept of personal branding 2,000 years before anyone else thought it was a good idea. You are not a general. You are not a charioteer, not an officer, not anyone important enough to have a tent with walls that actually keep the wind out. You are a nefer, a common foot soldier, which in Egyptian literally translates to something close to one of the good ones, which is either a beautiful piece of soldier morale boosting or a deeply ironic joke, depending on how the next 24 hours go for you. The word itself is interesting. It is the same root as the famous Nefertiti, meaning beautiful or good, and historians sometimes note that the Egyptians had a gift for naming things in ways that carried layers of meaning. Whether calling a common infantryman good was sincere encouragement or official optimism, nobody is entirely certain. The camp itself is not what you might be picturing if your main reference point is Hollywood. It is not a ragged, chaotic mess of tents and campfires scattered randomly across the dunes. Egyptian military camps, at least in the New Kingdom period for which we have the best evidence, were organized with a formality that would make a modern urban planner nod in grudging respect. We know this primarily from depictions on temple reliefs, most famously the reliefs at Abu Simbel and Luxor showing the camp scenes from the Battle of Kadesh, and from those images a clear pattern emerges. The camp is roughly rectangular, bounded by shields propped upright and interlocked to form a perimeter barrier. This is not a defensive wall that would stop a serious attack. It is more of a visual boundary, a statement of organized intent, and perhaps a modest deterrent against the casual infiltration of things you do not want wandering in during the night. Things like desert foxes, for example, or spies, or, in certain stretches of the Sinai and beyond, considerably larger and more motivated wildlife. The shield wall matters, and you will be helping to maintain your section of it as part of your daily duties, which means you will spend a non-trivial portion of your morning manhandling large pieces of wood and leather in full desert sun. You're welcome. Inside the perimeter, the camp is divided into zones with a logic that reflects Egyptian society's obsession with order, hierarchy, and the proper placement of everything relative to everything else. The pharaoh's enclosure, if Ramesses himself is present, and during the Kadesh campaign he very much was, occupies the center and rear, a camp within a camp that includes not just command tents but a kind of traveling throne room complete with staff, scribes, and even a small menagerie of royal animals. Ramesses famously brought a lion named Slayer of his foes into battle, which is either the most intimidating military mascot in history or a serious logistical nightmare for whoever was in charge of feeding it. Probably both. Radiating outward from the royal enclosure are the quarters of the officers, then the divisions of infantry, then the charioteers and their horses, and then, at the outermost ring before the shield wall, the lowest-ranked soldiers, which, for tonight's purposes, means you. Your sleeping arrangements are a reed mat on the ground, a coarse linen blanket that smells like every person who has used it before you, and the sand, which is everywhere, in everything, and has developed what feels like a personal grievance against you specifically. The Egyptian army of the New Kingdom was organized into large divisions, each named after a major deity, Ammonius, Ra, Ta, Set, and containing roughly 5,000 men, subdivided into companies of 200 and squads of 50. This is a mainstream historical fact that still impresses military historians. The organizational sophistication required to move, feed, supply, and coordinate forces of this size across desert terrain without motorized transport, without radio communication, and without GPS was genuinely extraordinary. Commanders used runners, signal fires, and a system of drum and horn calls to coordinate movement, and the logistics of water supply alone would fill several academic volumes, several of which do, in fact, exist. There is a quirky footnote to that organizational structure that most people never hear about. Some Egyptologists believe that certain regiments included significant numbers of foreign soldiers, Nubian archers, Shurden mercenaries from the Mediterranean coast, and others who brought their own fighting traditions, their own gods, and their own somewhat chaotic energy to the strict Egyptian camp hierarchy. The Shurden in particular are fascinating. They appear in Egyptian records first as raiders and pirates causing serious trouble along the Mediterranean coast, and then, almost without narrative transition, as elite mercenary soldiers serving in the Egyptian royal guard. Historians still argue whether this transformation represents a formal diplomatic arrangement, a military press gang operation, or simply the ancient world's version of, if you can't beat them, hire them and point them at someone else. The camp is waking up around you now in layers. First the animals, horses and donkeys whose night-long patience with the heat and the flies has definitively run out. Then the cooks and water carriers, who have the misfortune of being the first humans required to be functional. Then the junior officers, whose job it is to make sure everyone else is functional, a task they approach with the particular enthusiasm of people who have been doing it for long enough that enthusiasm is no longer the right word. And finally, the main body of soldiers, your colleagues, your tent mates, your fellow travelers in this experiment in ancient endurance, who surface from sleep with the coordination and good humor of people who went to bed hungry, slept on the ground, and fully expect today to be worse than yesterday. The sun clears the eastern horizon, and the change is immediate and absolute. The cold that had the sand clutching at your feet evaporates so quickly that you almost wonder if you imagined it. Within minutes, not hours, minutes, the temperature begins its daily climb toward the kind of heat that does not merely make you uncomfortable but actively begins to dismantle your body's best efforts to keep you alive. In the Sinai in summer, midday temperatures regularly exceed 40 degrees Celsius, which is 104 degrees Fahrenheit for those of you who prefer your suffering in the imperial system. The desert does not warm gradually. It does not ease you in. It simply turns a dial, and the dial only goes one direction, and there is nothing you can do about it except begin immediately making decisions about water, shade, and movement that will determine whether you see the sunset. You have approximately half a liter of water in the skin beside your mat. That is your personal ration until the next water distribution, and the next water distribution is not, under any circumstances, guaranteed to arrive on schedule. The logistics of water supply in a desert campaign were the single most critical factor in Egyptian military planning. More important than weapons, more important than numbers, more important, arguably, than strategy. We know from records of the Ramesside period that water was transported in large clay amphorae loaded onto donkeys, and that advance parties were sometimes sent ahead to wells and oases to assess availability and set up supply chains. When this system worked, armies could move. When it failed, they died. Not in battle, not from enemy action, just from the desert doing what the desert does. You pick up your water skin, resist the very powerful urge to take a long drink right now, at 6 in the morning, when the temperature is merely uncomfortable rather than lethal, and you look out across the camp that will be your entire world for the foreseeable future. It is, you have to admit, a remarkable thing to behold. Thousands of men, the sun cutting long shadows across the sand between the rows of low tents, the smell of bread beginning to bake somewhere near the center of camp, the distant clink of someone working with metal, a weapon being sharpened, a fitting being repaired, and over all of it, the vast, flat, pitiless sky, already luminous with the kind of blue that only desert skies achieve, as if the color has been boiled down and concentrated by the same heat that is trying to kill you. You have made it to dawn. You have survived the night, which, for a first-timer in this environment, is actually not nothing, because desert nights carry their own hazards involving temperature, scorpions, and the particular existential loneliness of lying under an unfamiliar sky with 100 anxious thoughts and a linen blanket that smells like previous strangers. Now comes the day, and the day, in an ancient Egyptian desert military camp, has a schedule, a hierarchy, a set of rules, a theological framework, and a collection of physical demands that will test every system you have in ways your modern life has not even approximated. The trumpet sounds a second time, sharper now, insistent. Around you, men begin to move with the mechanical efficiency of people who have learned that moving quickly now means slightly less misery later. Someone shoulders past you without apology. Someone else is already rolling up his sleeping mat with the focused energy of a person who has decided that efficiency is the closest thing to comfort available. You stand up. You roll your shoulders. You look at the horizon, which is already shimmering very slightly with the first breath of the heat that is coming. You are here. You are a soldier of the two lands, a Nefer in the army of the great Ramesses, a person standing at the edge of the known world in the most organized, most formidable, most completely exhausting military machine that the ancient world had yet produced. And your first full day in camp has not even properly started yet. The soldier beside you, a compact, sun-darkened man whose name you have not yet learned and whose patience with new arrivals is clearly limited, shoves a bundle of linen in your direction without ceremony or explanation. This apparently is your kit, your uniform, your armor against the desert and, to a somewhat lesser degree, against the people the desert is hiding. You shake it out, hold it up, and try to read it the way someone might read a map they have never seen before, looking for clues about what kind of journey they are actually on. What you are holding is, in its essentials, a linen kilt. It is called a shendit, and it is the foundational garment of the Egyptian male wardrobe across essentially every social class and professional category, from the pharaoh on his golden throne to the field laborer in the mud. The version you are holding is the military edition, which means it is slightly shorter than the civilian cut, sitting above the knee rather than below it, because the Egyptian army had long since learned that fabric that gets in the way of your legs when you are running toward or away from something is fabric that is working against you. It is off-white, stiff with previous use and imperfect washing, and it has the texture of something that began its life as fine cloth and has been working very hard ever since. You wrap it around your waist the way you have watched the men around you do it, tucking and folding with a confidence you absolutely do not feel, and the immediate sensation is one of those deeply paradoxical desert experiences. It is, against all expectation, not unpleasant. Linen, as a fabric technology, is genuinely remarkable in hot, dry environments. It is woven loosely enough to allow air to move through it. It absorbs sweat efficiently and releases it quickly, which creates a modest but real cooling effect, and it does not trap heat against your skin the way wool or leather would. The Egyptians had been cultivating flax and weaving linen for several thousand years by the time you arrive, and the refinement of that craft had produced something that, while not glamorous, was precisely calibrated for the climate in which it was being used. You are about to feel very smug about your excellent linen kilt when someone hands you your sandals. These are the standard military sandal of the New Kingdom Egyptian foot soldier, and they are made from papyrus reed, the same plant that Egyptians used to make writing paper, rope, boats, and apparently also footwear, which tells you something about either the versatility of papyrus or the resourcefulness of people who had limited options. They are flat, minimal, essentially a sole with two leather thongs that pass between your first and second toes and loop around your ankle in a configuration that engineers of every subsequent century have reinvented and called new. They are, in the most technical sense, sandals. They are also, in the most practical sense, not quite adequate for what you are about to do in them. The issue is not the design, which is actually intelligent. The issue is the ground. Sand, when it is cold or moderately warm, is merely unpleasant to walk on in thin-soled sandals. Sand, when it has been sitting in direct sun for several hours, achieves temperatures that would be remarkable on a stovetop. Egyptian soldiers spent significant portions of their days walking on surfaces that were registering temperatures of 60 degrees Celsius or higher at ground level, well above the boiling point of water, just in case you needed that comparison to fully appreciate the situation. The papyrus sole provides some insulation, but not enough to make the experience what anyone would call comfortable. What it provides is the difference between walking and not walking, which, when you are a soldier with orders to cover ground, is the only difference that matters. You tie the sandals on, stand up, and take a few experimental steps. The sand shifts under you in that particular way it has, not quite solid, not quite liquid, just constantly slightly wrong underfoot, requiring constant small adjustments from every muscle between your ankles and your hips. If you are not used to it, walking on sand is genuinely tiring in a way that is difficult to explain until you have done it. It recruits muscle groups that flat, stable surfaces never bother. Your calves, your arches, the stabilizer muscles along the outside of your ankles, all of them suddenly have opinions about what you are doing. By the end of a full day of walking in this stuff, soldiers who were physically fit and highly trained described symptoms that we would now recognize as overuse fatigue in the lower extremities. Soldiers who were not fit or who were new tended not to describe it in words so much as in the way they sat down at the end of the day and did not immediately get up again. The rest of your kit assembles itself around you in pieces. Over the linen kilt goes a leather apron, several hanging strips of tough leather, sometimes reinforced with small bronze or copper studs, that protect the thighs and groin in the approximate manner of a very confident optimist. It is called a tab, and it is one of those pieces of equipment that is clearly better than nothing while also being clearly not, technically, armor in any robust sense of the word. The leather is stiff and smells powerfully of the tanning process, which involved substances you are better off not thinking about too carefully at this hour of the morning. For your upper body, you have two options depending on your rank and budget, and since you are a common foot soldier without particular distinction, you have the option that costs less, a leather or padded linen vest, open at the front, providing modest protection to the torso while preserving enough freedom of movement to use your arms. Wealthier soldiers and officers had access to scale armor, small bronze or leather scales stitched in overlapping rows to a backing fabric, providing genuine ballistic protection at the cost of significant weight and, in direct sun, a tendency to become hot enough to cook with. Your vest is not that. Your vest is the military equivalent of hoping for the best while doing something marginally sensible with your hands. On your head goes a war helmet, in your case made from thick linen built up in layers, a construction technique called quilted linen armor that sounds like something from a craft project but actually performs meaningfully well against glancing blows, which is the optimistic version, and is better than nothing, which is the realistic version. Bronze helmets existed and were used, primarily by elite soldiers and officers, but bronze helmets in desert sun create an environment inside them that begins to approach the temperature of the surface you are walking on, which is to say, an environment that is bad for the brain you are trying to protect. The linen helmet, for all its humble materials, thermoregulates better. It does not trap heat the way metal does, and a wet cloth wrapped inside it could provide genuine cooling through evaporation. This is, in fact, excellent thermal engineering, arrived at entirely through empirical trial and error over generations of soldiers discovering what did and did not preserve them. Here is the quirky detail about Egyptian military dress that almost never makes it into the popular accounts. There is substantial evidence that at least some Egyptian soldiers, particularly in extremely hot conditions or on garrison duty rather than active campaign, simply did not wear the full kit. Inscriptions and artwork show considerable variation in what soldiers are depicted wearing, and some Egyptologists have suggested that field commanders exercised pragmatic discretion about uniform requirements when the alternative was heatstroke. Historians still argue whether this represents official tactical flexibility or simply the eternal human tendency to take your tie off when the boss isn't looking, but either way, the image of the perfectly uniformed ancient soldier turns out to be somewhat idealized. Now comes the part of your equipment that is neither protective garment nor footwear but is, in many ways, the most important thing you are carrying, your weapons. As a common foot soldier in the New Kingdom Egyptian infantry, your primary weapons are a spear and a kepesh, and the combination tells you something important about how Egyptian military doctrine had evolved by this period. The spear is simple, long, and honest about what it is. A wooden shaft of acacia or cedar, tipped with a bronze blade, somewhere between 1.5 and 2 meters in total length. It is a thrusting weapon, primarily, though it can be thrown in extremis, and it functions best in the kind of massed, coordinated infantry formations that the Egyptian army had refined over centuries. You hold it in your right hand, and the first thing you notice is the weight. Not enormous, but persistent, the kind of weight that after an hour of carrying it in the heat begins to feel like a quiet argument you are losing. The kepesh is something else entirely. It is one of the defining weapons of the New Kingdom period, and it is beautiful in the way that things designed for a single violent purpose are sometimes beautiful, efficient, purposeful, stripped of ornament. It is a sickle sword, with a straight handle and a blade that curves outward and forward in a crescent shape, and it is used in a hooking, pulling motion that can trap an opponent's weapon or pull them off balance. It was almost certainly adopted from Canaanite or Hittite military culture, another example of the Egyptian military's impressive habit of encountering a weapon that worked and immediately deciding it was Egyptian, and by Ramesses' time it had become iconic enough that pharaohs were depicted wielding it in temple reliefs at a scale roughly the size of a small building. You hang your kepesh from the leather strap at your waist and try to settle into the weight of it. It is well balanced, actually. Whoever made it knew what they were doing, and the way it sits at your hip feels, if you are being honest, pretty good. This is the complicated truth about military equipment across most of history. The individual pieces, taken alone, often represent genuine excellence. It is the combination of all of them, worn simultaneously in conditions of extreme heat, that begins to produce the compounding misery. Your shield completes the ensemble. It is large, nearly your own height, made from ox hide stretched over a wooden frame, roughly rectangular with a pointed top, and painted in a bold pattern of black and white or red and white that serves both as unit identification and, theoretically, as a degree of psychological intimidation. It is heavy. It will become heavier. By the time you have carried it across a full day of desert terrain, it will feel as though it has developed both personal mass and a grudge. Now stand still for a moment, fully equipped, and consider what is happening to your body. You are wearing multiple layers of linen and leather. You are carrying, combined, somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 15 kilograms of equipment. The temperature is continuing its morning ascent toward the kind of numbers that require clinical language to describe accurately. Your feet are separated from ground that is approaching frying pan temperatures by a few millimeters of woven reed. Your head is enclosed in quilted linen. And you have not yet eaten breakfast, completed morning prayers, attended to your weapons maintenance, or reported to your squad leader for the morning assignment. There is a certain type of person who, reading all of this, would feel a deep visceral respect for the soldiers of the ancient world, for their toughness, their endurance, their capacity to function under conditions that would dismantle a modern person within hours. And that response is correct and appropriate. But there is also a certain honesty required here, which is that they did not choose these conditions in the way a modern person might choose to challenge themselves. They were born into a world where this was simply what life was, where the alternative to endurance was death, and where the frame of reference did not include the comfortable baseline against which hardship can be measured. They were not tough in spite of knowing softness. They were tough because softness, for them, was not an available concept. You look down at yourself, the kilt, the apron, the vest, the sandals, the shield, the spear, the kepesh at your hip, and you try to imagine carrying all of this until sundown. The man next to you, who has been doing this for 3 years, notices you looking and says something in a dialect of ancient Egyptian that you cannot follow. But the tone is unmistakable. It is the same tone that experienced people in physically demanding professions have used across every culture in every century of human existence when addressing someone who is new and already looking worried. It means roughly you get used to it. He does not tell you how long that takes. The smell reaches you before the food does, which is either a mercy or a warning depending on how you interpret it. It is a dense, yeasty, slightly scorched smell bread, unmistakably, but bread made under conditions that a bakery inspector from any subsequent century would find concerning. It drifts across the camp from the cooking area near the center of the enclosure, threading through the smell of animals and leather and sun-warmed sand, and your stomach responds with an enthusiasm that your brain, once it processes what breakfast is actually going to look like, will not entirely share. You follow the smell because you follow the men around you, and the men around you are moving toward the food distribution point with the focused, unhurried efficiency of people who have learned that urgency and hunger are not a productive combination. There is a queue organized roughly by squad, because the Egyptian military's commitment to order extends even to the morning bread line, and you take your place in it and wait while the light continues to strengthen and the temperature continues to climb and your stomach continues to make its case for immediate action. The bread, when it reaches you, is a flat, dense round roughly the size of your palm, made from emmer wheat, a variety older than the civilization handing it to you, a grain that has been the caloric backbone of Egyptian life since before the pyramids were a concept anyone had considered. Emmer wheat is not the soft, refined wheat of modern bread making. It is a harder, rougher grain that produces a bread with more texture, more fiber, and considerably more grit, literal grit, because the stone grinding process used to mill it consistently deposits fine particles of stone and sand into the flour, and those particles end up in the bread, and the bread ends up against your teeth, and your teeth, over the course of a life spent eating this bread, end up worn down in a way that ancient skeletal remains confirm with depressing consistency. Egyptian mummies, even royal ones, show significant dental wear, and for common soldiers eating field rations, the situation was considerably more pronounced. You bite into it. It is not bad. This is your first surprise of the morning, and it is a genuine one. It has a nutty, slightly sour flavor, the sourness from a natural fermentation process similar to sourdough, and the density that initially seemed like a problem turns out to be a feature because it is filling in a way that lighter bread is not, and filling is what you need right now. The grit is there, yes, detectable as a faint grinding sensation against your back teeth, and you make a mental note to eat slowly and carefully, because cracking a tooth in an ancient Egyptian desert camp is the beginning of a problem with no clean ending. With the bread comes a small clay bowl of beer. You were perhaps expecting water or hoping for it, and the substitution of beer feels at first like a morale initiative, a small kindness from the army commissariat. It is not, or at least not primarily. It is logistics. The water situation in this camp, as you already know from your intimate relationship with your half-liter skin, is precarious enough that it cannot be used for brewing and drinking simultaneously. But more fundamentally, the beer itself, thick, cloudy, low in alcohol, made from partially baked bread dissolved in water and allowed to ferment, is safer to drink than raw water from many of the sources available in the field. The fermentation process, while nobody in 1275 BCE understood the microbiology of why this worked, produced an environment hostile to many of the pathogens that made untreated ancient water a genuine health risk. Soldiers drank beer not because the Egyptian army was especially progressive about morning beverage options, but because beer was less likely to kill them than the alternative, which is a sentence that holds up under scrutiny even if it sounds like something you would say at a very particular kind of party. The beer is thick enough to chew, faintly sour, and has the approximate alcohol content of modern kombucha, present but not relevant. You drink it from the clay bowl, which is rough against your lips and has a faint earthy taste from the clay itself, and you eat your bread, and you look around at the camp in the early morning light and try to take stock of your caloric situation with the honesty it deserves. What you have just consumed is the bulk of your caloric intake for the day. This is not a dramatic statement. It is simply the arithmetic of ancient military logistics. The Egyptian army fed its soldiers, and by the standards of the ancient world it fed them with a consistency and organizational commitment that was genuinely impressive. But the quantities were calibrated for survival and function, not for comfort, and the modern concept of 3 substantial meals with snacks between them bears essentially no relationship to the feeding schedule of a New Kingdom foot soldier on campaign. The core ration, what was officially allocated per soldier per day, was built around bread and beer, supplemented when supply lines and terrain permitted with dried or salted fish, onions, garlic, lentils, and occasionally dried figs or dates. The fish was usually Nile perch or catfish, dried in the sun to a leathery consistency that extended its shelf life dramatically, while also concentrating its flavor into something that can only be described as extremely committed. You will encounter it later in the day, and the encounter will be memorable. The onions and garlic were not optional extras. They were considered medicinally significant, believed to protect against illness and boost strength, and their distribution was taken seriously enough that we have records of ration complaints when the garlic supply ran short. Ancient soldiers, it turns out, were willing to march enormous distances and face considerable danger. But they drew the line at marching without their garlic. Some things are genuinely universal. Here is the mainstream historical fact about Egyptian military provisioning that most people do not appreciate. The logistics system that supported New Kingdom campaigns was genuinely sophisticated enough to have impressed later military administrators. Supply chains extended hundreds of kilometers, with way stations, fortified wells, and prepositioned caches of food and water at intervals along primary campaign routes. The Egyptians maintained a string of forts across the Sinai specifically to support military operations, each fort positioned to provide a day's march from the last one, so that an army moving along the coastal road, the ancient route called the Way of Horus, was never more than 1 day from resupply. This was not accidental. It was the result of centuries of operational experience encoded into institutional military practice. The quirky footnote to all of this excellent logistics is the question of what soldiers ate when the logistics failed, which happened with a regularity that the official records are somewhat reluctant to acknowledge. Field improvisation in the ancient world meant hunting, foraging, and in particularly difficult moments, consuming things that the ration planners had not intended to be food. There are hints in various texts of soldiers eating desert plants, insects, and at least in one account that historians debate the interpretation of, something described in terms that suggest significant culinary desperation. The Sinai Peninsula, while not entirely devoid of life, is also not a place that rewards casual foraging. What lives there has adapted to conditions of scarcity and tends to defend its own caloric resources with a commitment matching the environment that produced it. You finish your bread and your beer and sit for a moment with the empty bowl in your hands, doing the mental calculation that every soldier in every army across most of history has performed at some point in their service. How much did I just eat? And how much is it actually going to cost me to do what I am about to be asked to do? The answer, which you already sense without being able to fully articulate it, is that the math is not entirely in your favor. The water distribution happens after the food, and it is administered with a ceremony that reflects how seriously the camp takes this particular resource. A water officer, a real position with real authority, because water is power in its most literal ancient sense, oversees the filling of individual water skins from the large storage amphory, and the quantity each soldier receives is measured, recorded, and non-negotiable. Your allocation for the morning is approximately 1 liter, which sounds reasonable until you consider that you are about to spend several hours doing physical work in temperatures that will comfortably exceed 40 degrees Celsius, and that the human body under those conditions can lose more than 1 liter of fluid per hour through sweat alone without any particular exertion. 1 liter, for the morning, in the desert, while carrying 15 kilograms of equipment and training for war. You hold your water skin with a new reverence that is indistinguishable from anxiety. The preservation methods used to keep food viable on campaign deserve a moment of attention, because they represent one of those areas where ancient ingenuity and ancient necessity produced solutions that were simultaneously impressive and deeply unappetizing to the modern sensibility. Salt was the primary preservative, and the Egyptian state had good access to it. Natron, a naturally occurring sodium compound found in dried lake beds, was used for everything from food preservation to mummification, which means that at some point the same substance that kept your dried fish edible for weeks was also doing something that you would rather not think about in the embalming tent on the other side of the camp. This is a fact that ancient Egyptians were presumably fine with and that modern food safety inspectors would approach with a great deal of caution. Honey was used as a preservative for certain foods, particularly fruits and, interestingly, wounds. More on that when you visit the camp physician, and the resulting honey-preserved rations had a sweetness and caloric density that made them valuable enough to be allocated preferentially to officers and elite units rather than distributed to common soldiers. You will not be receiving honey-preserved rations. You will be receiving the garlic. The cooking itself, in a field camp, was a communal activity organized by squad, with each small group of soldiers responsible for preparing their own food from the raw rations distributed centrally. The fuel for cooking fires was a constant logistical challenge in desert environments where wood was scarce. Dried animal dung was commonly used, which produced a fire that burned adequately and smelled the way you are now imagining it smelled, which is accurate. Cooking was done in the early morning and again in the late evening, when the temperature was at its least aggressive, and the middle of the day was for eating whatever had been prepared earlier rather than adding heat to an environment that was already providing more than enough. There is an interesting detail about the organizational structure of mealtime in Egyptian camps that speaks to the society's broader values. Food was not merely fuel in the ancient Egyptian understanding of the world. It had religious and social dimensions that persisted even in field conditions. Offerings of food and beer were made to the gods before soldiers ate. A quick ritual acknowledgement of divine support that took only minutes but was observed consistently enough to be recorded in military texts. The god most commonly invoked at mealtime in a military context was Montu, the hawk-headed war deity, though Ammonius, the great state god whose name the most prestigious division bore, received acknowledgement as well. Eating without this ritual acknowledgement was, in theory, a form of impiety. In practice, very hungry soldiers in the field probably operated on a theological sliding scale when the bread was ready and Montu's altar was 15 minutes walk away. Historians still argue whether the religious observances recorded in official military documents reflect actual universal practice in the field or represent an idealized version of camp life recorded by scribes who were performing their own kind of propaganda, presenting the army as pious and disciplined because that was the image the state wanted preserved, regardless of what the soldiers were actually doing while the bread was hot and the officers' backs were turned. You have finished eating. Around you, the camp is in the full motion of mourning. Men checking weapons, officers conducting inspections, animals being fed and watered with a priority that reflects the Egyptian military's very clear-eyed understanding that horses were more expensive and harder to replace than soldiers. The sun is now fully above the horizon and has committed entirely to its project of making you regret every decision that led you to this particular latitude. You look at the bread crust left in your hand, a small, hard piece, the last of your morning ration, and you consider eating it now or saving it. The man beside you, the compact veteran who gave you your kit this morning, watches you with an expression of professional neutrality. Then, without speaking, he reaches into the small bag at his belt and produces a dried fig, slightly dusty, absolutely unremarkable, and holds it out to you. You take it. You eat it. The sweetness is startling. A small, genuine pleasure in a morning that has been organized mostly around absence. The sugar hits your blood with a clarity that makes you understand, viscerally, why ancient peoples attached religious significance to sweet things. This fig, dried on a roof somewhere in the Nile Delta months ago and carried across the Sinai in a soldier's personal kit, is the best thing you have eaten since you arrived. The veteran watches you eat it with the satisfaction of someone who has just demonstrated something they did not need to explain. He was right. You do get used to it, just not to the hunger. The inspection happens without warning, which you will later understand is entirely the point. One moment you are standing at the edge of your squad's area, brushing bread grit from your teeth with a twig that someone assured you was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of dental hygiene, and the next moment a shadow falls across you that is longer and more authoritative than any shadow you have encountered since arriving. You look up. You immediately wish you had finished the dental hygiene portion of your morning before this particular moment. The man standing in front of you is a Chedi, not the great vizier of all Egypt, but a senior officer at the company level whose title carries enough administrative weight to make the distinction feel academic. He is tall, which helps, and he is wearing the kind of expression that has been refined over years of looking at soldiers and finding them wanting. His linen is whiter than yours. His sandals are leather rather than papyrus, and the staff he carries is not a weapon but a symbol of administrative authority that somehow feels more threatening than the kepesh at your hip. He looks at you the way a craftsman looks at an apprentice's first attempt, not without interest, but without particular optimism. To understand what this man represents, you need to understand the hierarchy you have just entered, because it is not merely a chain of command in the modern military sense. It is a theological, administrative, and deeply personal structure that connects the soldier standing in the sand to the divine presence sitting on the golden throne in Thebes, and every link in that chain carries weight, obligation, and consequence. At the absolute apex of the structure is the pharaoh himself, not merely commander-in-chief but living God, the embodiment of Horus on earth, the point at which the divine and the military intersect with a force that the modern concept of morale does not quite capture. When Egyptian soldiers fought, they were not fighting for a nation-state in the modern sense, or for an ideology in the political sense, but for the maintenance of Ma'at, the cosmic principle of order, truth, and right that the pharaoh's existence guaranteed and his enemies perpetually threatened. Defeating Egypt's enemies was not merely a military objective. It was a theological necessity. The world worked because Ma'at was maintained. The pharaoh maintained Ma'at. The army maintained the pharaoh's ability to do so. You, standing in the sand with bread grit on your teeth, are therefore a participant in the maintenance of cosmic order. Feel appropriately significant. Below the pharaoh in the military hierarchy was the commander-in-chief, in practice usually the crown prince or a senior royal official, followed by the Chedi at the administrative level, then the Imyr the general commanding a full division, then the HRYPDT, the standard-bearer commanding a company of 200 men, then the IMYRSA, the platoon commander overseeing 50, and finally the Herpeti, the squad leader responsible for 10 men. Your squad leader is a man named something you cannot yet pronounce correctly, and he has been managing your existence since before breakfast with a combination of quiet efficiency and barely contained irritation that suggests he has trained new soldiers before and has not yet made peace with the process. The inspection proceeds in the methodical way of all military inspections across all eras, a systematic examination of your equipment, your person, and your bearing that is designed simultaneously to identify deficiencies and to remind you that you exist within a system that is larger, older, and considerably more patient than you are. Your shield is examined for damage. Your spear point is checked for proper seating. Your Kapesh is looked at, turned over, looked at again. The senior officer says something to your squad leader that you cannot follow, and your squad leader responds with the tone of a man accepting a verdict he anticipated. Your sandals, it transpires, are not tied correctly. This is the kind of detail that feels trivial until you understand that improperly secured sandals in desert terrain lead to blisters. Blisters lead to open wounds in a desert environment lead to infections. Infections in an ancient military camp lead to outcomes that the camp physician, whom you will meet later, is honest enough to acknowledge are not always good. The Egyptian military's attention to equipment detail was not bureaucratic pedantry. It was the accumulated institutional knowledge of an organization that had learned, through significant losses, what small failures in the field eventually cost. You retie your sandals while the officer watches with the patience of a man who has somewhere better to be but has decided that making this point is worth the time. When you finish, he says something brief and moves on to the next soldier, and your squad leader leans close enough to explain, in terms you are beginning to understand, that you will retie your sandals correctly every morning from now on, and that the correct way is not the way you did it just now, and that the difference matters. The rank structure you have just encountered at its most personal level operates through a system of rewards and punishments that was, by ancient standards, relatively codified. We know from surviving administrative texts that the Egyptian military maintained records of individual soldier conduct, that promotions were tied to demonstrable performance in both training and combat, and that the rewards for distinction included land grants, gold of valor, actual gold collar decorations awarded by the pharaoh personally, additional rations, and the social elevation that accompanied recognized service. This was genuinely motivating in a society where land ownership and social status were the primary currencies of a good life, and where the path from common soldier to decorated veteran to minor landowner was real enough to be worth pursuing. The punishments occupied the other end of a spectrum that had considerably more range. Minor infractions, equipment failures, tardiness, minor insubordination were addressed with physical punishment, typically beating with a stick, administered by a designated officer with a pragmatic efficiency that treated the transaction as corrective rather than vindictive. This was not considered unusual or particularly cruel by the standards of the time. It was simply how organizations maintained standards in a world where the alternative to discipline was the kind of disorder that got people killed. The beating was recorded, the infraction noted, and life continued. More serious offenses, desertion, cowardice in the face of the enemy, theft from fellow soldiers, certain kinds of insubordination towards senior officers, carried consequences that escalated into territory that the PG-13 rating on tonight's script prevents us from exploring in full detail, but which ancient sources describe with a directness that leaves nothing ambiguous. What matters for your present situation is that you are aware the system exists, that it is enforced, and that the officer who just corrected your sandals has both the authority and the institutional support to make your life significantly worse than it currently is. There is a layer of authority in this camp, however, that sits above even the senior officer with the white linen and the administrative staff. An authority that cannot be argued with, cannot be appealed to, and cannot be physically avoided. This is the authority of the gods, mediated through the camp's religious personnel, and in the New Kingdom Egyptian military it was as operationally significant as any human chain of command. Each division of the army was named for a deity, Ammonius, Ra, Ta, Set, and this naming was not merely organizational branding. It established a theological relationship between the soldiers and their patron god that carried real obligations on both sides. The soldiers were expected to honor their division's deity through correct ritual observance, proper conduct, and the kind of performance in battle that reflected well on the god's name. In return, the god was expected to provide protection, strength, and the divine favor without which no military operation could succeed. This was a contractual relationship in the most sincere ancient sense, and both parties were understood to take it seriously. The camp's hemnetcher, priests who traveled with the army, were not chaplains in the modern pastoral sense. They were ritual specialists whose job was to maintain the correct relationship between the army and the divine, to read omens, to perform the sacrifices and offerings that kept the gods engaged and supportive, and to interpret signs in ways that informed tactical decisions. Before a major engagement, the hemnetcher would examine the entrails of sacrificed animals, observe the behavior of birds, and consult oracular procedures to determine whether the gods approved of the proposed action. Historians still argue whether the generals who received these divine verdicts truly believed in their accuracy or treated them as a useful mechanism for communicating decisions already made through rational analysis, a way of giving military necessity the language of divine mandate. What is not arguable is that a negative omen, or a verdict of divine disapproval, could genuinely delay or alter military operations. We have records from the Ramesside period of campaigns that were modified, timing changed, routes adjusted, specific objectives reconsidered, based on what the priests reported from their observations. The theology was not decorative. It was load-bearing. Your relationship with this theological dimension of military life is, for the moment, managed for you. You are expected to participate in the morning ritual, a brief ceremony at the small portable shrine that every squad maintained, involving a few words of acknowledgement to the appropriate deity, a small offering of food or beer, and the kind of formulaic prayer that was more about maintaining the correct form of the relationship than expressing personal sentiment. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of daily paperwork, not inspiring necessarily but absolutely required, and the kind of thing whose absence is noticed. The quirky detail about the divine terror aspect of Egyptian military life that most narratives skip over is this: the god Set, deity of chaos, storms, the desert, and foreigners, was simultaneously the patron of one of the army's primary divisions and a figure of profound ambivalence in Egyptian theology. Set was dangerous, unpredictable, and morally complex in a way that the more straightforward deities were not. His soldiers were Set's soldiers, which meant they were associated with the desert's destructive energy, which made them terrifying in battle and somewhat alarming in garrison. Other divisions regarded Set's soldiers with a mixture of respect and the particular wariness you reserve for colleagues who are very good at their jobs and slightly unnerving to be around. Whether this reputation helped or hurt morale in mixed division camps is one of those questions the sources raise more clearly than they answer. The officer has finished his inspection and has moved on, and your squad leader is now delivering a briefing, your first formal orientation to the day's schedule. in a tone that assumes you are following the language better than you currently are. You catch enough to understand the structure: morning weapons drill, midday rest during the peak heat hours when movement is medically inadvisable, afternoon patrol, evening rations, and prayer. The middle of the day belongs to the sun, and the Egyptian military, whatever its other unreasonable demands, was realistic enough about the desert's physics to build the schedule around them rather than against them. You look at the officers retreating back, the white linen, the authoritative posture, the staff that is somehow more intimidating than a weapon, and you experience the particular feeling of someone who has just understood, completely and for the first time, that they are very small within a very large system. The system has been running for hundreds of years. It has absorbed new soldiers and difficult terrain and hostile enemies and the occasional catastrophically bad divine omen, and it has continued. It will continue after you. Your job within it is to be adequately functional, correctly positioned, and properly sandaled. Your squad leader looks at you, then pointedly at your feet, then back at your face. You look down. One sandal thong has already begun to loosen. You retie it immediately, correctly this time, while he watches, and the small nod he gives you in acknowledgement is so minimal that it almost does not exist. But it does exist. And in the economy of approval available to a common soldier in an ancient Egyptian desert camp, you will take eye. The weapons drill begins at the second hour of the day, which in the Egyptian timekeeping system means roughly 2 hours after sunrise, when the sun has cleared the horizon enough to provide full light but has not yet achieved the kind of vertical authority that makes outdoor physical activity a medical event. This window, you will quickly understand, is not generous. In summer in the Sinai, the margin between workable heat and dangerous heat is measured in hours, and the Egyptian military had learned to use those hours completely. Your squad assembles at the designated training ground, which is a cleared area of packed sand at the eastern edge of the camp, marked at its corners by wooden posts driven into the ground and strung with rope, a boundary that defines the space as purposeful, official, and inescapable. The sand here has been worked by previous drills into a surface that is harder than the loose stuff near your sleeping area but still shifts unpredictably underfoot, and the rope boundary has the psychological effect of making the space feel smaller than it is, which is probably intentional. Confined spaces focus attention. Focused attention is what the man now walking toward you from the western post requires. Your weapons instructor is a Kenyu, a trained fighter of the second tier, experienced enough to have survived multiple campaigns and skilled enough to have been assigned to training duties rather than frontline service, which in the Egyptian military represented either a mark of distinction or a subtle form of retirement, depending on how you read the administrative record. He is not large by the standards of the men around you, but he moves with the particular economy of someone who has thought very carefully about how to use exactly as much energy as a situation requires and no more. A skill that in a desert environment is as tactically important as any weapon proficiency. He looks at your squad the way a craftsman looks at raw materials, with assessment, not affection. The first thing he does is take your spear away from you. This is not punitive. It is diagnostic. He holds it at arm's length, sights down its length the way you might sight down an arrow, checks the seating of the bronze tip, flexes the shaft slightly to test for any give that might indicate a crack in the wood. Then he hands it back, makes a brief note in whatever mental accounting system he uses for these assessments, and moves to the next soldier. What he is doing, you understand, is establishing baseline, finding out what he has to work with before he decides what he is going to do about it. The warm-up, such as it is, consists of movement drills, not stretching in the modern sense, because the concept of stretching as injury prevention was not part of ancient athletic preparation, but a series of walking and jogging patterns across the training ground that serve to activate the muscles and joints while also beginning the process of recalibrating your body to sand movement. Remember what was said earlier about sand and its particular demands on your lower extremities? Those demands are now being called upon at pace, and the stabilizer muscles along your ankles and calves are registering their opinions with increasing volume. The mainstream historical fact about Egyptian military training that tends to surprise people is how formalized it was. The Egyptian army was not a feudal levy system where farmers picked up weapons when called and put them down again when the crisis passed. By the New Kingdom period, Egypt maintained a professional standing army, supplemented by conscription during major campaigns, and the professional corps underwent systematic training that began in childhood for many soldiers. Young men, boys, really some as young as 12 or 13, were enrolled in military training programs attached to garrisons and temple complexes, where they learned not just weapon skills but reading, writing, basic mathematics, and the administrative competencies required by an army that ran on records and requisitions as much as on physical force. The weapons drill proper begins with the spear. Your instructor demonstrates the basic thrusting sequence, a controlled step and extend motion that generates force from the legs and hips rather than the arms, the spear moving as an extension of the whole body's momentum rather than a thing being pushed by the hands alone. It is elegant in the way that effective physical technique is always elegant, the body arranged to accomplish a specific task with minimum waste. He does it 3 times, slowly, and then points at you. You do it once, at approximately half the required speed, with the form of someone who has never done it before, which you haven't. He watches. He says nothing. He points at you again. You do it again. It is marginally better. The step and extend requires a coordination between your foot placement and your arm extension that your nervous system has not yet mapped, and the result is the kind of slightly jerky, slightly hesitant movement that marks a beginner in any physical discipline. The body doing the thing but thinking about each component separately rather than integrating them into a single fluent action. He demonstrates again, this time exaggerating the hip rotation that drives the thrust, and something about seeing it from that angle clicks in your understanding. You try it. The coordination is still rough, but the direction is correct, and he gives you the same minimal nod that your squad leader gave you over the sandal situation, an acknowledgement so compressed it could be mistaken for a blink, but meaning, in context, that you are moving in the right direction. The spear work continues for what feels like an hour but is probably closer to 30 minutes, cycling through thrust, parry, and the basic footwork patterns that allow you to advance, retreat, and maintain your position in a formation without creating gaps that an opponent can exploit. Formation integrity is the obsession at the center of Egyptian infantry tactics. The idea that a line of soldiers who maintain their spacing and move as a single organism is worth dramatically more than the same number of individuals acting independently. Your job in any engagement is not primarily to be a brilliant individual fighter. Your job is to be a reliable component of a system, to hold your position, advance when the formation advances, and not create problems for the men beside you who are also holding their positions and advancing when the formation advances. This is, when you think about it, a profoundly different mental model of combat than the heroic individual warrior narrative that ancient literature tends to celebrate. Temple reliefs show Ramesses personally slaughtering dozens of enemies with godlike efficiency, which is tremendous for state propaganda and the wall decoration business and not a particularly accurate representation of how battles were actually won. Battles were won by formations holding under pressure, by logistics delivering water and weapons at the right moment, by commanders making correct decisions about terrain and timing. The individual heroics were real, they happened, but they were the exception, and the Egyptian military machine was built around the rule. After the spear work comes the Kapesh drill, and here the dynamic shifts in an interesting way. The Kapesh, remember that beautiful, lethal sickle sword at your hip, is a weapon that rewards individual fluency in a way the spear does not. Its curved blade and hooking motion require a different kind of body mechanics, more rotation in the torso, more use of the wrist, a willingness to move inside an opponent's reach that the long spear explicitly avoids. Your instructor handles it with a familiarity that borders on affection, and watching him work through the basic sequences is watching someone who has spent enough hours with this particular tool that it has become an extension of his thinking. Your first attempt with the Kapesh is humbling in a specific way. The weight distribution of the curved blade means that the weapon wants to continue its arc past the point where you intend it to stop, and controlling that momentum requires a muscular engagement that you have not yet developed. You overswing twice and nearly take out the soldier drilling beside you, which earns you a sharp word from the instructor and a reproachful look from the soldier that you will see in your memory for some time. The shield work is its own discipline, and it intersects with both the spear and the Kapesh in ways that make simultaneous coordination nearly impossible for a beginner. The large oxhide shield is not merely passive protection. It is an offensive tool used to push, to crowd an opponent's space, to control the geography of a close engagement. Holding it correctly while also managing a spear or Kapesh requires the kind of dual-task physical coordination that only comes with repetition, and the repetition required is measured in months of practice rather than hours. You are not good at this. You are actively, demonstrably, unreservedly not good at this, and the training ground does not permit the kind of polite ambiguity that social situations sometimes allow. You are either holding the shield correctly and moving the weapon correctly, or you are not, and the feedback is immediate and physical. A tap from your instructor's staff on the elbow that is poorly positioned, a verbal correction when your footwork collapses, the simple evidence of the drill partner across from you finding it very easy to get past your guard because your guard has an architectural flaw you cannot yet identify from the inside. Here is the quirky detail about Egyptian weapons training that historians find fascinating and that popular accounts almost never include. There is evidence from tomb paintings and from some textual sources that Egyptian military training included a form of competitive wrestling or grappling that was practiced alongside weapons work, and that this grappling had formal rules, recognized holds and counters, and something resembling a competitive structure with winners and losers. Some Egyptologists believe this represented not just physical conditioning but a form of controlled aggression management, a way of giving soldiers a sanctioned outlet for competitive violence that built useful skills without the lethality of actual combat. Whether it was also simply entertaining to watch and whether off-duty soldiers bet on the outcomes is the kind of question the sources teasingly suggest without fully confirming. Historians still argue whether the training regimens depicted in New Kingdom sources represent universal practice across all military units or reflect the elite institutions that happen to produce the records we have, leaving open the possibility that the formal, sophisticated training described was the ideal rather than the norm, and that plenty of soldiers went into battle with considerably less preparation than the official picture suggests. The chariot activity on the adjacent training ground provides a constant, dramatic backdrop to your infantry drill. The sound of hooves on packed sand, the snap of reins, the occasional shout of a chariot commander correcting a driver's line. The chariotry was the prestige arm of the Egyptian military, the ancient equivalent of an air force in terms of tactical impact and social cachet, and the men who drove and fought from chariots were drawn from the wealthier classes, because maintaining a chariot, 2 horses, and the associated equipment was a personal financial commitment that common soldiers could not meet. The chariots themselves were engineering marvels. Light, fast, built from bent wood and leather with a wheel design refined over generations to be strong enough to survive battle terrain, while light enough to be pulled at speed. An Egyptian war chariot carried 2 men, a driver and a fighter, who stood on the platform and used a composite bow to deliver arrow fire at a rate, and from a distance that infantry simply could not counter. The composite bow, made from layers of horn, wood, and sinew laminated together, was another piece of Egyptian military technology that represented generations of accumulated craft knowledge, capable of driving an arrow through light armor at distances that made the engagement deeply one-sided. You watch the chariot's wheel and return across the training ground during a brief pause in your own drilling, and you feel something that is difficult to name exactly, a mixture of genuine admiration for the skill involved and a very clear-eyed appreciation for the fact that you are on the side of the people the chariots are designed to kill. In actual battle, your role as an infantry soldier in relation to your own side's chariotry is to hold the center while the chariots break the enemy formation on the flanks, and then to advance through the disorder the chariots create and finish what the arrows started. It requires you to trust that the chariots are doing their job, the same way the charioteers trust that the infantry is doing theirs. It is a system built on mutual dependence and coordinated timing, and when it works it is, by all historical accounts, devastating. When it does not work, when the timing fails or the formation breaks or the chariots cannot create the disorder they need, what happens to the infantry is not something we need to describe in detail tonight. The morning drill ends with a formation exercise, the entire squad moving together through a series of advance and halt sequences, practicing the drum signal responses that translate command decisions into collective movement on a battlefield where shouted orders cannot be heard over the noise of engagement. The drum patterns are simple: 2 beats advance, 3 beats halt, a rolling pattern retreat. You learn them in the last 20 minutes of drill, and by the end you are responding to them with a delay that your instructor clearly finds frustrating and that you find entirely reasonable given that you have known them for 20 minutes. The sun is now at an angle that has moved from merely assertive to genuinely aggressive. The temperature on the training ground has crossed a threshold that your body is registering as an emergency even though your mind is trying to process it as merely uncomfortable. Sweat is running freely down every surface of you, soaking the linen kilt, pooling in your sandals, making the Kapesh grip slippery in your hand. Your water skin, which you have been rationing with admirable self-discipline, is approximately half empty, and the midday rest that your morning briefing promised is still a full hour away. Your instructor calls the end of drill with a single sharp clap, surveys the assembled squad with the expression of a man recalibrating his expectations to match available reality, and dismisses you with a brevity that contains its own message. You survived the morning drill. You did not distinguish yourself. You did not embarrass yourself beyond the Kapesh overswing incident, which multiple people witnessed but which no one, mercifully, seems to be planning to mention again today. You pick up your shield from where you set it down during the final formation work. It is heavier than it was this morning. That is not possible physically, but it is absolutely true experientially, and the distinction between those two things is one of the fundamental lessons of the Egyptian desert camp, that what your body reports and what the arithmetic says are often in productive tension, and navigating that tension is most of the job. You walk back toward the shade of the camp's interior, and you drink a careful, measured sip of water that is approximately half the amount your body is requesting, and you think about the afternoon with the philosophical acceptance of someone who has run out of better options. The injury announces itself during the midday rest, which is its own particular cruelty, the 1 hour of the day specifically designated for not acquiring new problems, and your body chooses it to present the bill for the morning's activities. It is your right hand, the web of skin between your thumb and index finger, where the Kapesh grip rubbed during the overswing sequences, and the skin has responded by opening in a thin, shallow split that is not serious by any objective measure and is producing, by any subjective measure, a disproportionate amount of discomfort. You look at it in the filtered light of the shade structure, a stretched linen canopy propped on wooden poles that converts direct sunlight into something merely oppressive, and you make the decision that most people in most armies across most of history have made when confronted with a minor injury in a demanding environment. You decide to ignore it. Your squad leader notices it approximately 4 minutes later, because squad leaders in the Egyptian military were specifically trained to notice exactly these kinds of things, and he points at the camp physician's area with a brevity that makes clear this is not a suggestion. You go, partly because you have been given no meaningful alternative, and partly because there is something genuinely interesting about where you are going, something that your modern assumptions about ancient medicine have not prepared you for. The camp's medical area is located near the center of the enclosure, not far from the officer quarters, a placement that reflects both the practical logic of keeping medical resources centrally accessible and the social reality that the people most likely to receive the best medical attention were the people whose survival was most operationally significant. The area consists of several low structures, one for the storage of medical supplies, one for treatment, and one whose precise function you are not immediately certain of but which has a smell that suggests purposes you are not yet ready to investigate. Outside the treatment area, sitting on a low stool with the patient composure of someone who has learned that waiting is most of the job, is the SW&W, the physician. He is older than most of the men you have encountered in camp, perhaps 50, which in this time and place represents a survival achievement worthy of respect, and he has the particular stillness of someone whose professional life has required the development of very good observational skills and the discipline not to react to what those skills observe. He looks at your hand, looks at your face, and gestures for you to sit on the low bench beside him with the efficiency of a man who has processed many soldiers and has calibrated his bedside manner to the available time. What happens next is one of those moments that collapses the distance between the ancient world and the present in a way that is genuinely startling. He examines the wound with clean, methodical attention, pressing gently around the edges to assess depth, checking for embedded material, evaluating the color of the surrounding skin. These are recognizably the correct things to do. The logic behind them, assessing tissue damage, looking for contamination, checking for signs of early infection, is the same logic a modern physician applies, arrived at through the same empirical process of observing what happens when you do and do not do these things, accumulated over generations. Egyptian medicine, at its practical clinical level, was significantly more sophisticated than its popular reputation suggests. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical documents in human history, dating to around 1600 BCE but believed to copy an even older text, contains systematic case descriptions of injuries and conditions with a clinical rigor that astonishes modern physicians who read it. Cases are presented with examination findings, diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment recommendations, organized in a logical sequence that would be recognizable in structure to a modern medical student. The document distinguishes between treatable conditions, conditions that might be treatable, and conditions that are not treatable, a level of prognostic honesty that took Western medicine a surprisingly long time to redevelop. The phrase used for the hopeless cases, in translation, is roughly an ailment not to be treated, a sentence of devastating clinical clarity that a modern palliative care physician might recognize with a mixture of admiration and sadness. Your physician opens a wooden case of supplies with the careful attention of someone who knows exactly what is in it and exactly how much of each thing remains. What comes out first is honey. A small clay pot of it, thick and golden, and the smell of it in the hot air is startlingly sweet against the background of dust and leather and sun. He applies it to your wound with a small wooden spatula, and you feel the immediate cooling and warming sensation that honey produces on broken skin, and you think, this is a folk remedy, this is the ancient equivalent of doing something because it feels like doing something. You are wrong. Honey has genuine, well-documented antimicrobial properties. The combination of its low water content, its acidity, and its hydrogen peroxide production creates an environment that is genuinely hostile to bacterial growth. Modern wound care research has repeatedly confirmed that honey, particularly certain varieties, performs meaningfully well as a topical antimicrobial. The ancient Egyptians did not know why it worked in the terms we would use to explain it, but they had observed, correctly, that wounds treated with honey healed better than wounds left untreated. And they had encoded that observation into medical practice with the reliability of people who took their empirical evidence seriously. Over the honey goes a linen bandage, applied with neat, practiced wrapping that uses enough layers to provide genuine protection without restricting the movement of your fingers. He ties it off with a knot that manages to be simultaneously secure and easily removable, and then he does something unexpected. He reaches into the case again and produces a small amulet, a blue faience figurine of the dwarf god Bes, a deity associated with protection, healing, and the warding off of malevolent forces, and places it on the bench beside you while he speaks a brief incantation. This is the point where ancient Egyptian medicine and modern medicine have their most visible disagreement, and it is worth sitting with the complexity of it for a moment rather than rushing past it. The physician is not doing the honey and the bandage instead of the magic. He is doing the honey and the bandage and the magic because in his understanding of how illness and injury work, both are necessary. Disease and injury in the Egyptian medical framework had dual causes, physical and supernatural. The honey addresses the physical. The amulet and the incantation address the supernatural. Treating only one dimension while ignoring the other would, in his framework, be as incomplete as a modern physician treating infection without addressing the immune system. Historians still argue whether this dual approach represents a genuine integrated belief system or a transitional state. Evidence of rational medicine emerging from a magical framework but not yet fully separating from it. Some scholars emphasize the clinical texts as evidence of Egyptian medicine moving toward empiricism. Others point out that magic and medicine remained thoroughly intertwined in Egyptian practice for the entire duration of Egyptian civilization, and that the narrative of medicine escaping from magic imposes a modern framework on an ancient reality that was more comfortable with complexity than we tend to credit. The quirky detail about the camp physician's practice that most people find unexpected is this: Egyptian medicine had a surprisingly sophisticated pharmacopoeia, a list of substances used for medical purposes, that included several compounds whose active mechanisms we can now explain, even if the Egyptians could not. Willow bark, used for pain and fever, contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Garlic, used for infection and respiratory complaints, has documented antimicrobial properties. Castor oil, used as a purgative, works exactly as described. Opium, used for pain management, works exactly as described, and there is evidence from various sources that Egyptian physicians were using it with an understanding of dosage and effect that implies significant clinical experience. What the pharmacopoeia also included, in generous quantity, were substances whose inclusion defies any modern pharmacological explanation. Crocodile dung, for example, which appears in several gynecological prescriptions, and mouse-based compounds, and a variety of minerals whose therapeutic value is, to put it diplomatically, unestablished. The juxtaposition of the willow bark and the crocodile dung in the same medical tradition is one of those historical facts that resists a clean narrative. It was not all brilliant. It was also not all superstition. It was both simultaneously, in proportions that varied by condition and practitioner, and the honest answer to the question of how good ancient Egyptian medicine was depends heavily on which condition you had and which physician you encountered. You flex your bandaged hand. It feels genuinely better. The honey has done something real to the discomfort, and the neat wrapping provides a compression that reduces the small persistent sting. The physician watches you flex it with professional attention, makes whatever mental note he makes, and says something that you're improving but still limited. Ancient Egyptian translates roughly as, "Keep it clean, keep it covered, come back if it swells." This is, you realize with a start, exactly what a modern emergency room physician would say about the same wound. Across 3,000 years of medical development, the advice for a minor hand laceration has remained essentially unchanged, which is either deeply comforting or suggests that the fundamentals were sorted out early and what followed was refinement. You look around the medical area while you sit recovering your composure, and you notice things you had not registered on arrival. The storage structure contains, visible through its open doorway, rows of clay pots and linen-wrapped bundles of herbs and compounds, organized with a systematization that mirrors the camp's broader commitment to order. There are surgical implements visible on a low table, bronze blades, probes, clamps, that are recognizable in function even if different in material from their modern equivalents. There is a low bed of clean sand for patients requiring rest, and beside it a small brazier for heating water or implements, currently unlit in the midday heat. There is also, in a corner that you almost miss, a small shrine. Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of healing and pestilence, the deity who could both send disease and cure it, whose priests were among the most respected physicians in Egypt, whose dual nature as destroyer and healer encoded a sophisticated understanding of the ambivalent relationship between the body and the forces acting on it. The shrine is modest. A small carved stone figure, a burned-down offering of incense, a few dried flower petals, but it is clearly maintained with regular attention, and the physician's relationship with it, when he briefly touches the figure as he passes, carries the ease of a long-established habit. Sekhmet's priests deserve a specific mention here because they represent one of the most interesting intersections of religion and practical medicine in the ancient world. The priests of Sekhmet were trained physicians as well as ritual specialists, and their training, conducted at temple schools, combined medical knowledge with theological practice in a way that produced some of the most skilled practitioners in the ancient world. The military physician treating your hand may or may not be one of Sekhmet's priests formally, but he operates within a tradition that they established, and the medical knowledge he carries was transmitted through institutional channels that the temples maintained and protected. Outside the medical area, the camp is in its midday stillness, the enforced rest period when the Egyptian military acknowledged what the desert was doing and got out of its way. The sound of the chariot training ground has quieted. The weapons drill areas are empty. Even the horses are in whatever shade their handlers have constructed for them, standing with the patient resignation that horses in hot climates develop as a survival strategy. You stand, thank the physician with a gesture that seems approximately correct for the cultural context, and walk back into the white glare of the midday camp. Your hand feels better. The amulet of Bes, which the physician has tied to the bandage with a small cord, swings gently against your wrist as you walk, and you are surprised to notice that you find it, in some way you cannot entirely explain, genuinely comforting. Maybe that is what it was always for. Not the intervention of actual supernatural forces, but the reassurance that the forces marshaled on your behalf are not limited to what your own body can do, that there is something larger paying attention, something invested in the outcome of your small, specific wound in the sand at the edge of the world. The afternoon is waiting. The patrol assignment will be announced within the hour. Your hand is bandaged, your water skin is partially refilled. The physician's area maintains a small medical water reserve, and he gave you an additional half-liter with the pragmatic logic of someone who knows that dehydration is the enemy of healing, and you are, by the standards of your current situation, in reasonable shape. You walk back past the cooking area, past the shield wall perimeter, past the section of camp where the scribes are working in the shade, because the Egyptian military ran on paperwork as much as on bronze, and someone is always writing something down, recording the rations distributed, the equipment issued, the injuries treated, the orders given. Somewhere in those records, in clay and linen and careful hieratic script, your hand injury is being noted. 3,000 years from now, someone might read it. The patrol assignment comes from your squad leader with the same conversational warmth as everything else he delivers, which is to say, it arrives as a set of brief, precise instructions accompanied by a look that communicates both the expectation of competence and a realistic assessment of the probability of receiving it. You are assigned to the afternoon perimeter patrol, a rotating duty that sends small groups of soldiers in a circuit around the camp's exterior, maintaining awareness of the ground between the shield wall and the desert beyond. It sounds, described that way, like a relatively manageable task. A walk, some looking around. Fresh air, if fresh is a word that applies to air at 42 degrees Celsius that smells of dust and distant carrion. It is not a walk. It is a sustained confrontation with every threat that the desert, the geopolitical situation, and 3,000 years of accumulated military anxiety have conspired to place in the space between the camp and the horizon. And the afternoon light that greets you as you pass through the gap in the shield wall hits you with the force of something that has been building up pressure while you were inside. You step out of the camp's relative shade into full sun and the world immediately becomes a different place. Flatter, harder, more committed to its own logic. The ground outside the perimeter is sandy in places and rocky in others, and the transition between the two surfaces is unpredictable enough to require constant attention underfoot. The shield wall at your back diminishes quickly as you move away from it, and within 50 meters you are aware, in a way that is difficult to ignore, that the organized human world behind you is very small against the organized inhuman world in front of you. The Sinai Peninsula, despite its reputation as a featureless wasteland, is actually a landscape of considerable variety and specificity. It contains mountain ranges, wadis, dry riverbeds that can flood with devastating speed during rare rain events, salt flats, gravel plains, and the particular kind of gray-brown rocky terrain that manages to be both visually monotonous and physically complex to traverse. It is, in the ecological sense, a genuinely living environment, populated by organisms that have made the kinds of compromises with scarcity and heat that produce, over sufficient generations, either exquisite adaptation or extinction. The organisms that chose adaptation are your primary concern for the next 2 hours. Your patrol group consists of 5 soldiers, led by a junior officer whose experience with this particular stretch of terrain is evident in the way he reads the ground as he walks. A constant, almost unconscious scanning that takes in surface texture, shadow angles, the direction of disturbances in the sand, the behavior of the small birds that move through the area and whose reactions to things they can sense before you can provide information that an experienced patrol leader learns to read. He walks with his spear held horizontally, point forward and slightly down, which is the carry position for active patrol, immediately usable, not aggressively brandished, somewhere between readiness and restraint. The primary military threat you are patrolling against is real and present. The period of Ramesses II's reign was defined by the contest with the Hittite Empire for control of the Levantine Corridor, the strip of territory that connected Egypt to the rest of the ancient Near East, and the run-up to and aftermath of the Battle of Kadesh involved sustained intelligence. Operations on both sides. Hittite scouts were skilled, motivated, and operating in terrain they had studied. Egyptian intelligence failures contributed directly to the near disaster at Kadesh itself, where Ramesses walked into an ambush that came within a very narrow margin of ending his campaign, his army, and arguably his reign. The 2 Hittite scouts captured before the battle and interrogated, under conditions that the Egyptian record describes with a certain brisk efficiency, gave false intelligence about the Hittite army's location, a deception so effective that it shaped the entire Egyptian operational plan. Your patrol is therefore not ceremonial. It is not box-ticking. It is the practical intelligence gathering that prevents the kind of surprise that costs armies their shape before the first formal engagement. Your junior officer is looking for tracks, for disturbances in the sand that suggest human passage, for the glint of metal or water containers in the middle distance, for anything that should not be in this particular piece of desert on this particular afternoon. He finds a scorpion first, which is not the intelligence priority but is immediately everyone's priority regardless. It is a yellow scorpion, Liurus quinquestriatus, known in later centuries as the Deathstalker, which is a name that represents a significant improvement in scientific nomenclature's commitment to accuracy. It is sitting on a flat rock approximately 2 meters off the patrol line, and your junior officer spots it without breaking stride, points at it without drama, and continues walking. The message is clear. Noted, identified, not our problem if we do not make it our problem. The yellow scorpion of the Sinai is, by measurable toxicological standards, one of the most venomous scorpions in the world. It is also, in the context of the Egyptian desert camp, simply a fact of the environment, present, dangerous, and manageable through the same combination of awareness and avoidance that governs your relationship with most of the desert's hazards. Egyptian soldiers developed practical protocols for scorpion encounters, shaking out sandals and clothing before putting them on, checking sleeping areas before lying down, the particular stillness that experienced desert people develop that reads the ground before committing weight to it. These protocols were so embedded in desert practice that they were essentially invisible. Not a set of rules, but a texture of behavior that newcomers noticed and veterans no longer registered as deliberate. There is also, patrolling the airspace above the desert with its own agenda and priorities, the Egyptian cobra Nejahage, which has the distinction of being both a serious medical emergency and a religious symbol of royal power, the uraeus that rises from the pharaoh's crown as a symbol of divine protection and destructive power. This theological elevation did not make the cobra less dangerous on the ground, and encounters between soldiers and cobras were common enough that the camp physician maintained a supply of treatment compounds for envenomation that was, by ancient standards, impressively stocked. Whether any of the treatments actually worked against cobra venom in the clinically meaningful sense is a question the archaeological record raises with more honesty than it answers, but the existence of the supply tells you something about the frequency of the problem. The quirky detail about desert wildlife in the context of Egyptian military operations that most people do not know is this. There is evidence from various sources that certain large predators, lions, leopards, and in some periods crocodiles in river-adjacent camps, were not merely environmental hazards but genuine tactical concerns that shaped camp placement and patrol design. Lions in particular appear in enough military accounts to suggest that their presence in the operational theater was a routine planning factor rather than an extraordinary event. Ramesses' famous lion slayer of his foes, mentioned earlier, was not merely a mascot. It was evidence that the Egyptian elite had a working relationship with apex predators that combined genuine danger with cultural prestige in a way that only the most confident civilizations attempt. Historians still argue whether the stories of lions associated with Egyptian military campaigns represent literal accounts of specific animals or function as symbolic narratives. The pharaoh's lion is metaphor for his own leonine power, but the balance of evidence suggests that enough literal lions were present in enough literal situations to make the metaphor genuinely resonant with lived experience. The terrain changes as your patrol continues around the camp's eastern perimeter, the gravel plain giving way to a section of exposed rock where the surface has been baked to a reddish-brown that radiates stored heat with the generosity of something that has been absorbing it since sunrise. Walking on this surface is a specific kind of misery. The heat comes at you from above, from the reflected sun, and from the ground itself, creating a convergence of thermal sources that has no comfortable angle of approach. Your sandals provide what they provide, which is the difference between walking and not walking, and the rest is endurance. It is on this rocky section that your junior officer suddenly stops, goes still, and makes a hand signal you have learned in drill. Flat palm down, fingers spread, that means halt and be quiet. You stop. The four of you stop. The silence of the desert at midday is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of presence, of a landscape that is fully occupied by things that are very good at not announcing themselves, and the moment you stop making noise you become aware of all of it. Your officer is looking at a section of rock face approximately 30 meters ahead and to the left. You follow his line of sight and see, at first nothing remarkable. The same reddish-brown stone, the same angular shadows, the same heat shimmer that turns distant surfaces into liquid approximations of themselves. Then you see what he sees. A shadow that is slightly wrong. A shape against the rock that has geometry inconsistent with geology, too regular, too intentional, containing the particular stillness of something that is trying not to be a shape against the rock. It is a person. The next 30 seconds are the longest of your time in the camp, and they resolve not into violence but into recognition. The figure, when your officer calls out in the challenge formula, responds in Egyptian and turns out to be a scout from your own division's advance patrol who took a different route back and is now, based on his expression, as relieved to see your group as you are to understand the situation. Your officer delivers a reprimand for the confusion in terms that are brief, precise, and carry enough weight to ensure the scout will not generate this particular situation again. But the 30 seconds before resolution have done their work on you, and you are still processing the aftermath, the elevated heart rate, the absolute clarity of attention that precedes potential violence. The way everything else drops away when the body decides something important might be about to happen. As the patrol continues, the desert itself, independent of its fauna and its military complications, kills more soldiers than any of the above. This is not a dramatic statement. It is the straightforward arithmetic of physiology in extreme heat. Hyperthermia, the body's core temperature exceeding its safe operating range, begins to impair judgment before it impairs physical function, which is the particularly dangerous part. The earliest symptoms are things that feel like minor fatigue, slight confusion, a diminished sense of urgency about the water you should be drinking. By the time the physical symptoms become undeniable, the window for simple self-correction has often already closed. The Egyptian army knew this. It did not know it in the clinical terms we would use, but it knew it through observation and loss, through the accumulated record of soldiers who made poor decisions in the heat and the pattern of what those decisions looked like from the outside. The scheduling of military activity around the heat of the day, the water rationing systems, the observation of soldiers for signs of heat illness, the enforced midday rest, these were not humane policies in the modern sense of an institution choosing comfort. They were survival technologies developed through empirical trial and error, encoded into operational practice because the alternative was losing soldiers to the environment faster than you could recruit them. Your water skin, which you refilled partially at the medical area, is now down to its final quarter. You have been on patrol for approximately 90 minutes. The sun is beginning its afternoon descent, which sounds like relief and is not, because the afternoon descent means the sun is now at an angle that eliminates the modest overhead shade provided by your helmet and instead drives light directly into your face. And the temperature will not begin to meaningfully drop for another 2 to 3 hours. You take a carefully measured sip, enough to register, not enough to satisfy, and continue walking. The patrol completes its circuit at the western perimeter, where the shield wall meets the camp's main entrance, and your junior officer makes his report to the duty officer at the gate with the efficiency of someone who has determined that brevity is a professional virtue. Tracks observed to the northeast, possibly 3 days old, direction of travel unclear. One minor confusion incident, resolved, scout from advanced patrol. Wildlife, scorpion, 2 species of lizard, 1 evidence of large snake passage. Birds consistent with previous observation. Nothing indicating imminent threat. The duty officer writes this down in the records that the camp scribes maintain, and your patrol is dismissed. You walk back into the relative shade of the camp interior and stand still for a moment, letting your eyes adjust from the white blaze of the desert back to the merely bright interior light. Your legs are reporting the afternoon's accumulated invoice, the sand walking, the rocky terrain, the sustained movement in heat, with an itemized specificity that suggests a very long evening sitting down. The camp around you is coming back to life as the temperature begins its gradual retreat from its afternoon peak. Soldiers who have been resting through the worst of the heat are stirring. The horses are being watered with the priority they always receive. Somewhere in the cooking area, the evening ration preparation has begun, and the smell of bread is threading through the camp again like a small domestic promise that the day is moving toward its end. You have survived the patrol. You have survived the scorpion, the heat, the 30 seconds of genuine uncertainty against the rock face, and the ongoing slow-motion challenge of drinking less water than your body requires. You have learned something about the desert that cannot be taught in a briefing, that it is not hostile in the way that enemies are hostile with intent and strategy, but hostile in the way that physics is hostile, with absolute consistency and complete indifference to your specific situation. The desert does not want to kill you. It simply will if you give it the opportunity. You have not given it the opportunity today. That is, by the standards of the afternoon you have just had, an achievement worth acknowledging. The sun touches the western horizon with a drama that feels, after the day you have had, almost personally directed. A slow, spectacular dissolution of light across the sky that turns the desert from a place of flat, hostile utility into something briefly, genuinely beautiful. The sand goes gold, then orange, then a deep reddish purple that makes the landscape look like something painted by someone who had strong feelings about color and no interest in restraint. The shield wall casts long shadows eastward across the camp interior, and those shadows are cool in a way that the word cool has not meant anything to you since this morning's pre-dawn chill. And you walk into one and stand in it and simply experience the absence of direct sun on your skin with a gratitude that is almost embarrassing in its intensity. The transformation of the camp that happens at this hour is one of the things about ancient military life that the daytime experience does not prepare you for. During the day, the camp is functional, organized around work, movement, logistics, the maintenance of the machine. At evening, it becomes something else, something older and more human, stripped of institutional purpose and revealing the texture of the lives being lived inside it. Fires appear, small, controlled cooking fires first, then the larger communal fires around which the evening gathers its social shape. The smell of bread and dried fish gives way to the smell of wood smoke, which in the desert has a particular clarity, the smoke rising straight up in the still evening air before dispersing at height into the darkening sky. The evening ritual begins before the cooking fires are fully established, and it begins with the sound of the hemnetcher, the camp priest, striking a small bronze bell that rings with a clarity that carries across the entire camp interior, cutting through the evening noise with the particular authority of a sound specifically designed to command attention. This is the call to evening prayer, and the response it produces tells you something important about the Egyptian soldier's relationship with the divine. It is not reluctant, not performative, not the shuffling compliance of people fulfilling an obligation they resent. It is, for most of the men around you, something closer to genuine relief. The prayer gathering is informal by the standards of temple worship. There is no grand architecture, no processional, no elaborate ritual sequence requiring specialist knowledge. Each squad assembles around its portable shrine, a small wooden box painted with the image of the squad's patron deity and containing a carved figure, some dried flowers, and a few personal offerings that soldiers have accumulated. Your squad's shrine holds an image of Ammonius, the great state god, ram-headed and serene, and the figure has been handled enough times that the paint on its surface is worn smooth at the points where fingers habitually make contact. Your squad leader leads the prayer in the low, rhythmic cadence of someone who has said these words so many times that they have become a bodily practice rather than a cognitive one. The way long-practiced prayers in any tradition acquire a quality of automatic fluency that is different from performance and different from mere habit. Something in between that carries its own kind of sincerity. The words invoke Ammonius' protection, acknowledge his power, request his continued favor for the soldiers under his name. They thank him for the day's survival, and you notice, with a small private shock, that this phrase in the prayer is not rhetorical. It is literal. Survival today was not guaranteed. It has been achieved. It is worth thanking someone for. You participate as best you can, following the cadence if not the words, and the man beside you, the veteran who gave you the fig this morning, who has been your most consistent guide through the day's navigation, says nothing about your imperfect participation. He simply continues the prayer beside you, and his presence has, by now, acquired a steadiness that you have come to rely on without having formally decided to. The mainstream historical fact about ancient Egyptian religious practice in military contexts that consistently surprises modern readers is how personal it was. Alongside the great state religion with its elaborate temple hierarchies and its theology of cosmic order, ordinary Egyptians, soldiers, craftsmen, farmers, maintained a vigorous parallel practice of personal piety directed at accessible, approachable divine figures. Household gods and personal protective deities received attention and offerings in ways that bypassed the formal temple system entirely, and soldiers in the field developed particularly intense relationships with their personal protective deities because the stakes of divine favor were, for them, immediately and physically obvious. The god Bes, whose small faience amulet is still tied to your bandage from the physician's visit, was one of the most popular personal protective deities in the Egyptian world. A dwarf figure with a leonine face and an aggressive posture that was interpreted as protective rather than threatening. A divine bouncer standing between the person wearing his image and the forces that wish them harm. Bes appears in domestic contexts, in medical contexts, and in military contexts with a frequency that tells you he was genuinely beloved in a way that the great state gods, for all their theological magnificence, may not have been in the intimate daily sense. You flex your bandaged hand. The honey under the linen has done its quiet work through the afternoon, and the wound, while present, has moved from the sharp early discomfort to a manageable dull awareness. Bess or honey or both or the simple passage of time, the causation is unclear and possibly beside the point. The cooking fires are now fully established and the evening meal is underway, and this is where the social life of the camp reveals itself most fully. The food is still the food, the dried fish that fulfills its earlier promise of being memorably pungent, more bread, lentils cooked with onion and garlic in a clay pot that has been making this particular dish long enough to have seasoned itself with the accumulated flavors of previous editions. But the context of eating has changed completely from the morning's functional bread distribution. People are talking, actually talking, with the ease of people who have set down the day's demands and are now simply present with each other in the way that shared firelight tends to produce in human beings regardless of century or culture. The stories that move around the fire are a mixture of the practical and the fantastic, and this is where the evening reveals one of its richest layers. Soldiers in every army across history have told stories, and Egyptian soldiers were no exception. But the Egyptian storytelling tradition was particularly rich, drawing on a literary culture that had been producing written narratives since at least 2000 BCE and an oral tradition that ran considerably deeper than that. The soldier sitting across the fire from you. A broad-shouldered man from a delta town who has been on campaign for 2 years and has the particular sunburn of someone who started with a lighter complexion than the Sinai has permitted him to maintain, is currently recounting a story involving a magician, a wax crocodile, and a royal scandal, and the way the men around him are responding suggests this is a known story, a favorite, one of those narratives that functions as cultural common ground in the way that certain films or television episodes do in the modern world. The story he is telling is, as it happens, one that has actually survived, a version of the tale later preserved in the Westcar Papyrus, a collection of magical stories set in the court of the Old Kingdom pharaoh Khufu, builder of the Great Pyramid. The wax crocodile story involves a nobleman who discovers his wife's infidelity and gets revenge through a magical construct that becomes real and terrifying, and it has the rhythm and pacing of a story that has been told many times and refined in the telling, the dramatic beats landing in exactly the places where fire-lit listeners need them to land. You cannot follow all of the language, but you can follow the structure, and you watch the faces around the fire and see them doing what human faces do around a good story, anticipating, reacting, the small involuntary expressions of engagement that are the same in every language in every century. The quirky detail about soldier culture in ancient Egypt that historians find fascinating is the evidence of personal graffiti left by soldiers at various sites across Egypt and the Sinai Brief. Informal inscriptions scratched into rock faces and temple walls that record names, units, and occasionally personal sentiments. Some of these inscriptions are remarkably mundane. The ancient equivalent of Amenhotep was here, but others contain what appear to be jokes, boasts, and complaints, a textual record of the ordinary human consciousness that the official military documents were not designed to preserve. One such inscription, from a site in Nubia, contains what Egyptologists interpret as a complaint about the food that has a tone so recognizable across 3,000 years of military catering that it functions as a kind of temporal handshake between the ancient world and anyone who has ever eaten in a cafeteria. The superstitions of the Egyptian soldier deserve their own moment around this fire, because they were extensive, specific, and taken with a seriousness that the word superstition does not quite honor. The Egyptian concept of the supernatural was not a separate domain from the natural. It was the same domain, viewed at a different scale. The dream that a soldier had on the night before battle was not merely a dream. It was potentially a communication from the divine, carrying information about the coming day that should be interpreted and acted upon. Certain birds appearing from certain directions carried specific meanings. Particular configurations of stars were auspicious or dangerous for particular activities. The camp at night was understood to be a permeable space, not in any frightening sense, but in the matter-of-fact Egyptian sense that the boundary between the living world and the divine world was not a wall but a membrane, and that beings passed through it in both directions with a regularity that the properly attentive person could learn to recognize. The dead were not distant or absent in the Egyptian understanding. They were present in a different mode, and the relationship between living soldiers and their honored dead, their ancestors, their fallen comrades, was maintained through small daily acknowledgments, through the inclusion of the dead in prayers, through the understanding that the protective power of deceased family members extended into the field with their living relatives. This is, when you think about it in the evening quiet with the fire burning down and the stars beginning to establish themselves above the desert with a clarity that urban light pollution will one day eliminate from human experience. This is not a frightening cosmology. It is actually a profoundly comforting one. The Egyptian soldier at night was not alone in the universe. He was embedded in a web of relationships that extended in multiple directions, to the gods above, to the ancestors who had preceded him, to the living men around the fire, to the great institutional structure of the army and the state and the two lands, and ultimately to the pharaoh himself, who was the living point at which all of these relationships converged. The ghost stories that begin to emerge as the fire burns lower and the beer makes another appearance. Evening rations included a second beer allocation, which you are now considerably more appreciative of than this morning, are not horror stories in the modern sense. They are proximity stories, accounts of encounters with the dead, or with divine presences, or with the intermediate beings that Egyptian cosmology populated the world with, the Akh, the transfigured spirits of the honored dead, and the various supernatural entities that moved through the desert night with their own purposes. The tone of these stories is not terror. It is the tone of people describing a world they understand, even if they cannot always fully navigate it. The same tone that a skilled sailor uses when discussing weather, or a good tracker uses when discussing animal behavior. It is respectful, specific, and fundamentally at home. You listen, drink your beer, and watch the stars appear. The Egyptian night sky, 3,000 years ago, in a desert far from any city light, is something that requires a moment of separate attention. The Milky Way is not the faint smear that most modern people know from semi-dark suburban skies. It is a structural feature of the sky, a great luminous arc of such density and complexity that it would stop a modern urban person in their tracks and produce the particular silence of a genuine encounter with scale. The Egyptians called it the winding waterway, and they understood it as a celestial river along which divine barks traveled in patterns that reflected and informed earthly events. Their astronomical knowledge was sophisticated enough to track celestial bodies, predict events, and embed that knowledge into architecture with an accuracy that continues to impress modern astronomers. Historians still argue whether the astronomical alignments built into Egyptian temples and monuments represent a systematic theological program, a deliberate encoding of celestial knowledge into sacred architecture, or reflect a more opportunistic pattern finding, the human tendency to see meaning in coincidence elevated to institutional practice. The answer probably contains elements of both, and the debate itself is one of those productive disagreements that keeps a field of study alive and honest. Beside you, the veteran is lying on his back looking at the sky with the comfortable familiarity of someone who has been watching it for years and has made his peace with what it contains. He says something quiet and brief that you cannot fully translate, but the tone carries clearly across the language gap, the tone of someone acknowledging something large and certain and indifferent to human concerns, but finding that acknowledgement paradoxically comforting. The fire is coals now, the stories have quieted, and the camp is settling into its night configuration. Sentries at the perimeter, officers in their tents, the great mass of soldiers spreading themselves on their reed mats in the sand with the pragmatic efficiency of people who have learned to sleep when sleep is available because it may not always be. You lie down on your mat, and the sand beneath it holds the warmth of the day's heat, and above you the winding waterway stretches from horizon to horizon, and the desert, which spent all day trying to dismantle you, has gone quiet in the way that predators sometimes go quiet. Not because the threat has passed, but because the dark has changed the terms of engagement. Tomorrow will come. The trumpet will sound. The bread will be gritty and the water will be insufficient and the heat will make promises that the afternoon will keep. But that is tomorrow, and this is now, and now contains the stars and the cooling sand and the quiet breathing of a few hundred men who have done what was required of them today and are doing. Right now, the only thing that remains, resting in the dark at the edge of everything. The sky lightens from the east in the way it always does here, not gradually, not with the drawn-out theatrical hesitation of dawn in wetter climates, but with a decisiveness that feels like a statement of intent. One moment the stars are fully present, the winding waterway still arching overhead in its full luminous complexity, and then the eastern horizon begins to pale with a speed that suggests the sun is not arriving so much as returning, reasserting a claim that it never really relinquished during the few hours of darkness it condescended to allow. The sky moves through a sequence of colors, deep blue to violet to a burning, clear orange, that is almost identical to yesterday's dawn, because the desert does not vary its palette for the sake of novelty. It offers you the same performance every morning, and the performance is extraordinary every time, and the soldiers who have seen it hundreds of times still pause, briefly, before the trumpet sounds to register it. You are awake before the trumpet. This surprises you until you realize it should not. Your body has recalibrated overnight to the rhythms of this place with the speed that bodies recalibrate to unfamiliar demands when the demands are compelling enough. You lay awake in the final hour before dawn in the particular state of consciousness that desert nights produce, not quite sleep and not quite wakefulness, a suspension in which the sounds of the camp, the distant movement of a sentry, the brief comment of a horse, the small wind that moves through the camp in the hour before sunrise like a scout sent ahead by the day, registered clearly without requiring response. You catalog the night sounds with the passive attention of someone who has learned, in the space of a single day, that paying attention to the environment is not optional. Your hand aches under its bandage with the specific informative throb of a wound in its second day. Not the sharp early discomfort of yesterday, not the deeper warning sign of infection, but the productive ache of tissue doing the work of repair. You consider this a good sign and the physician's honey with something approaching genuine gratitude. The amulet of Bess still swings at your wrist, and you have stopped noticing it in the conscious way that you noticed it yesterday and started noticing it instead in the way that you notice things that have become part of the ordinary texture of your situation. Present, relevant, no longer remarkable. Around you, the camp stirs in the sequence you now recognize. The animals first, the cooks, the junior officers with their expressions of professional persistence, and then the general body of soldiers, surfacing from sleep with the same unglamorous efficiency as yesterday. The pragmatic bodies of people who have learned that the time between lying down and standing up is an administrative matter rather than a transition worth lingering in. You sit up and look at the camp in the pre-dawn light, and you see it differently than you did yesterday morning. Yesterday it was strange. The scale of it, the organization of it, the layered complexity of its hierarchy and its theology and its logistics all arriving at once with the overwhelming density of a new language encountered without preparation. Today it is still complex, but the complexity has acquired a structure that you can navigate. You know where the water distribution point is, and approximately when it will open. You know which section of the shield wall is your squad's maintenance responsibility. You know the drum signals for advance and halt and retreat, imperfectly but genuinely, in the way that things learned under physical duress tend to stick. You know that your squad leader's expression of barely contained irritation is his default expression and not a specific response to you, and that the minimal nod he dispenses as acknowledgement is, within his particular economy of approval, a generous currency. You know the veteran's silence, which turns out to contain more information than most people's conversation. What a single day in this camp has given you, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, in the last of the quiet before the trumpet, is not competence. You are not competent. You are the opposite of competent in most of the specific skills that life here requires. What you have acquired is orientation. The difference between a place being utterly foreign and merely demanding is not skill. It is understanding, knowing the shape of the thing, the logic of it, the way its parts relate to each other. Yesterday the camp was a collection of experiences happening to you. This morning it is a system you are beginning to understand from the inside. The trumpet sounds. You stand up. The morning bread arrives with the same qualities as yesterday's. The grit, the density, the honest nutty sourness that you have already begun to reframe from complaint to characteristic. And you eat it with the attention of someone who has learned that food in this environment is a resource rather than an experience, something to be metabolized efficiently rather than savored, though the savoring is not impossible and not unworthy. The veteran produces another fig from his seemingly inexhaustible personal supply, and you accept it without the surprise of yesterday, which feels like its own small milestone. The morning prayer at the squad shrine feels different on the second day. Not more understood, linguistically, the words are still mostly beyond your grasp, but more familiar in the way that rituals become familiar through repetition even without full comprehension. The rhythm of it, the specific cadence of your squad leader's voice in the invocation, the particular silence that follows the final phrase before the squad disperses. These have become yours in a small way, part of the texture of how days begin here. This is, you think, how traditions work at the individual level. Not through conviction arriving fully formed, but through repetition softening the strangeness until the strange thing becomes the normal thing, and the normal thing starts to feel, gradually and without any single moment of conversion, like something worth maintaining. The morning weapons drill is better than yesterday's, and better is not a word that covers enough ground to describe what the difference actually is, but it is the right direction. The spear thrust is smoother, not fluent, not natural, but connected in a way it was not yesterday, the body beginning to integrate the coordination that yesterday it was still calculating step by step. The Kapesh is still a work in progress, but you do not overswing and you do not threaten anyone adjacent to you, which represents a measurable improvement by the metrics that matter. Your instructor watches with the same assessment without affection expression, and at one point during the formation drill he corrects your shield position with a brief physical adjustment, a hand on your elbow. Repositioning the angle, that is the closest thing to direct instruction he has offered you, and you understand it as a signal that you are now worth correcting in detail rather than in principle. This is how skill acquisition works in physical domains, and the Egyptian military's training methodology understood this intuitively even without any formal pedagogical theory to describe it. You cannot explain the technique to someone and have them do it. You demonstrate, they attempt, they fail in specific ways, you correct the specific failures, they attempt again. The corrections accumulate into competence over a period of time that cannot be shortened below a certain threshold regardless of motivation or intelligence, because the body has its own timeline for encoding physical knowledge that the mind cannot override through effort alone. The Egyptian army had enough operational experience to know roughly how long it took to turn an untrained person into a functional soldier, and that timeline was measured in months for the basics and years for genuine proficiency. You are 1 day in. You are, by the honest reckoning of that timeline, essentially at the beginning. And yet the spear thrust is smoother. And you know the drum signals. And you retied your sandals correctly this morning without being reminded. The small things accumulate, and the accumulation of small things is how large competencies are built. And this is as true in 1275 BCE as it will be in every century that follows. Some things do not change because they are features of human learning rather than features of any particular culture or technology. And the Egyptian soldier experiencing his second morning of drill is continuous with every second morning of every learning process that human beings have ever undertaken. The mainstream historical fact that this second morning makes vivid in a way that no amount of reading could fully convey is the sheer duration of the New Kingdom Egyptian military project. This was not an army that existed for a campaign and then disbanded. It was an institution that ran for centuries, continuously, absorbing new soldiers and new threats and new technology and new strategic challenges, maintaining its organizational coherence across the reigns of multiple pharaohs, across periods of crisis and expansion and contraction, across the entire sweep of what historians call the New Kingdom period, roughly 500 years of sustained military institutional existence. The knowledge encoded in the training your instructor is delivering, the logistic systems that put bread in your hand this morning, the theological framework that connects your morning prayer to the divine mandate of the pharaoh in Thebes. All of this represents the accumulated product of that 500-year institutional project, refined through operational experience into a form so embedded that its practitioners carry it as second nature. You are touching, through your instructor's hand on your elbow, through the bread and the beer and the honey on your wound and the fig from the veteran's bag. You are touching the edge of something that took 500 years to build. The quirky detail about what eventually happened to the New Kingdom Egyptian military that most people do not fully appreciate is how gradual its transformation was. The system did not collapse suddenly. It evolved, absorbed, incorporated. Foreign mercenaries became senior commanders. Administrative reforms changed the logistic structure. The theological framework adapted to new political realities. The Egyptian military institution that you are touching this morning in the Sinai of 1275 BCE will still be recognizable, in modified form several centuries later, having survived the Bronze Age collapse that destroyed nearly every other major power in the region, having navigated the political complexities of the Third Intermediate Period, having adapted and continued with the institutional stubbornness of something that has been doing this long enough to know that continuity is itself a form of strategy. Historians still argue whether Egypt's survival of the Bronze Age collapse, the catastrophic system's failure that ended the Hittite Empire, destabilized Mycenaean Greece, disrupted the entire Eastern Mediterranean world around 1200 BCE, was the result of deliberate strategic adaptation, geographical advantage, institutional resilience, or some combination of all three that defies clean attribution. The debate is one of the most productive in ancient history, because the answer matters not just for understanding Egypt, but for understanding how complex societies navigate existential stress. A question with obvious contemporary resonance that scholars are honest enough to acknowledge while being careful about the specifics of the analogy. The afternoon of your second day unfolds with a different quality than yesterday's. The patrol assignment takes you to the western perimeter, which offers a different view of the landscape, a longer sight line toward the faint blue suggestion of hills in the distance that are somewhere in the direction of the Nile Valley, toward Egypt proper, toward the world of farms and temples and river floods and the accumulated domestic texture of civilization. Standing at the western edge of the perimeter and looking in that direction, you understand for the first time in a visceral rather than intellectual way what the soldiers around you are defending. Not an abstraction called Egypt, not a theological concept called Ma'at, but that specific blue suggestion of hills and everything behind them. The farms and the temples and the river are real. The people on them are real. The soldiers at this perimeter are the distance between that reality and the various forces that would like to alter it. This is what armies have always been, at their most fundamental level, beneath the hierarchy and the theology and the logistics and the weapons drill. They are the organized physical expression of a society's decision that certain things are worth protecting, that the cost of protection, in water and bread and sore feet and insufficient sleep and the 30 uncertain seconds against a rock face, is worth paying to preserve the thing being protected. Whether any specific army at any specific moment is actually protecting what it claims to be protecting, or serving interests that have more to do with power and less to do with the people watching from the farms behind the hills, that is the question that every soldier in every army across all of history has had to navigate for themselves, and the Egyptian soldier is no different. The official answer is always Ma'at, always the divine mandate, always the protection of the two lands. The personal answer varies by individual, by circumstance, by the specific quality of the bread that morning and the specific face of the person back home that the soldier is thinking about when the patrol reaches the western perimeter and the hills are visible in the distance. The veteran is on this patrol too, and when you both stop at the western edge and look toward those distant hills, he says something brief, and this time your improving grasp of the language catches the meaning. He says something that translates roughly as, "Same hills every time." And the tone carries clearly. The hills are a comfort, not a destination, not a promise. The veteran has been on enough campaigns to have made his peace with destinations and promises, but a constant, a thing that is there when you look for it. In a life of considerable uncertainty and physical demand, the persistence of the hills in the expected direction is its own kind of reassurance. You look at the hills. You think about everything the day has been, the bread, the drill, the patrol, the honey on your wound, the stars last night, the veteran's figs, the prayer in the pre-dawn stillness, the drum signals your body is beginning to learn. You think about the 500 years of institutional knowledge pressing forward through your instructor's hand on your elbow. You think about the scorpion on the rock and the shadow that turned out to be a friend and the water that was never quite enough. You think about what survives. Not the individuals, they are gone. Their reed mats returned to dust. Their names preserved only if they were important enough to be carved in stone or lucky enough to be mentioned in the records that the scribes maintained with such careful permanence. What survives is the shape of the thing, the organizational logic of the camp, which you can read in the archaeological record, the medical knowledge which passed through the papyri into later traditions, the bread which is still being made from emmer wheat in certain places by people who are not thinking about New Kingdom Egypt, the honey on the wound, the morning prayer said in a rhythm that the body learns before the mind does. These things survive because they worked. Not because anyone decided to preserve them as heritage, but because they solved problems that needed solving and the solutions were good enough to outlast the specific context that produced them. You are standing at the western perimeter of an ancient Egyptian desert military camp, watching the late afternoon light soften the distant hills into something gentle, and you are tired in every system your body contains, and your hand aches productively under its linen bandage, and your water skin is, as always, not quite full enough. And you are still here. That is the thing about the desert camp that you could not have understood before you arrived and cannot ununderstand now that you have spent a day and a night and another day inside it. It is not designed for comfort. It is not designed for happiness in any modern therapeutic sense. It is designed for continuation, for the maintenance of function under conditions that work against function at every turn, for the daily renewal of the decision to still be here tomorrow, to retie the sandals correctly, to eat the gritty bread, to take the carefully measured sip of water that is less than you want and exactly what you need. The soldiers of the New Kingdom Egyptian army made that decision every morning for 500 years. They made it in the Sinai and in Nubia and in the Levant and along the slow green curve of the Nile. They made it hungry and thirsty and tired and occasionally afraid, in heat that wanted to dismantle them and terrain that wanted to swallow them. They made it with honey on their wounds and beer in their clay bowls and a veteran's fig pressed into their hands by someone who had been making the same decision long enough to know that small kindnesses were part of what made the decision sustainable. They made it, and the hills persisted in the expected direction, and the dawn kept coming back with its unreasonable colors, and the winding waterway wheeled overhead in its great celestial arc, and the bread was always gritty and the water was always insufficient and the system continued. And now it is evening again, and the fire is being built, and somewhere in the cooking area the dried fish is making its presence known with its characteristic commitment, and the stars are preparing their nightly appearance above the desert that has been here since before the pharaohs and will be here long after the last stone of the last monument has been worn back to sand. You made it through the day. Both days. You are a Nefer, one of the good ones, and the word, for the first time, feels less like optimism and more like something earned. And now, let the fire burn a little lower, and let the desert night settle around you like a blanket that smells of wood smoke and ancient dust. You do not need to carry the weight of the Kapesh anymore, or the shield, or the long march of everything the day demanded. Let those things rest in the sand beside you, where they have always eventually ended up. Your breathing can slow now, matching the deep, patient rhythm of the desert at night. The long exhale of a landscape that has been holding its breath through the heat of the day and is finally, in the dark, releasing it. The stars are out, every one of them, more than you can count, more than you have ever seen, the winding waterway overhead so bright and close that you could almost believe it is a river you could travel, carrying you somewhere gentle on a current too slow to feel. Let the image of the camp soften at its edges, the fires becoming embers, the voices becoming murmurs, the murmurs becoming the small sounds of sleeping, the wind moving through the shield wall with a sigh that has been making this same sound for 3,000 years. The veteran is there, somewhere nearby in the dark, his breathing steady and slow, his fig supply presumably replenished for tomorrow. Your squad leader's irritation is folded away for the night. The physician's honey is quietly doing its work. The amulet of Bess is still at your wrist, warm from the day's accumulated heat, keeping whatever watch it keeps through the night. You are here and you are safe, and the desert that spent all day testing you has, for now, set down its examination. The sand beneath you holds the warmth of 10,000 years of sunlight, and above you the universe continues its long, slow turning. And all the people who have ever lain on their backs in the desert dark and looked up at these same stars are somewhere in that turning with you. The soldiers and the farmers and the physicians and the scribes and the veterans with their quiet knowledge and their inexhaustible figs. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let the camp sounds become a murmur and the murmur become a hum and the hum become the soft background of a sleep that is deep and well-earned and lit, very faintly, by 3,000 years of starlight. Rest now. You have lasted the day.